In Beijing, on the afternoon of May 14, 2026, two global leaders concluded a summit, their handshakes signaling agreements far beyond the immediate trade discussions. When the White House released the official readout of the Trump-Xi summit, the single most important line in that document had nothing to do with Boeing jets, nothing to do with American crude purchases, and nothing to do with Taiwan. This was despite President Xi making it crystal clear that Taiwan represents his sharpest red line, directly warning President Trump that mishandling it risks, in his exact words, collision or conflict between the two nations. None of those critical points, however, became the headline. The headline was that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open for the free flow of global energy, and that Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon. China, a nation that has been purchasing Iranian oil for years through a network of shadow tankers, independent refineries, and ship-to-ship transfers off the coast of Malaysia, just sat across from the United States and co-signed two of Washington's hardest red lines on Iran simultaneously in one meeting. China, Iran's largest oil customer, its economic lifeline, and the country that has quietly propped up Iran for a considerable period, has just flipped the script. They sat down with the United States and essentially endorsed a core American red line on Iran, two of them, in fact, concerning nuclear weapons and the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a minor development. It fundamentally alters the entire diplomatic battlefield. Iran's immediate response: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps just launched a 5-day military exercise named Martyr Commander. Beijing, meanwhile, ordered 200 Boeing jets. Iran, on the other hand, ordered the IRGC to conduct military drills around its capital, also called Martyr Commander. One of those actions is a clear peace signal, the other is a war posture, indicating that tensions could escalate once again. And for some reason, Iran appears to believe it is winning this negotiation, which is a truly remarkable assessment. Now that the shifts in the room between Beijing and the United States are understood, the full operational picture of China's leverage over Iran is staggering. Beginning with the energy mathematics, this is where China's true influence resides. China imports 11.66 million barrels of crude oil per day, a record high as of 2025. Iran has been supplying roughly 1.6 million of those barrels daily, often disguised through ship-to-ship transfers off Malaysia and Indonesia to circumvent U.S. sanctions. That accounts for approximately 1 out of every 7 barrels China consumes, delivered at a deep discount because Iran has no other major buyers on the same scale as China, which remains its largest crude purchaser. This figure is notable because China's record-high oil imports, coupled with its reliance on discounted Iranian crude, historically positioned Beijing as Iran's indispensable economic partner, making its current public alignment with Washington a significant departure from its long-standing strategic ambiguity in the region. In recent weeks, China resumed purchasing American crude at approximately 600,000 barrels per day. Alaskan, North Dakota, or Texas crude is now being acquired at a higher level by Beijing, valued at close to $10 billion per month at current prices. Meanwhile, President Xi Jinping publicly informed President Trump that China opposes the militarization of the Strait and any Iranian attempt to levy tolls on shipping, a monumental declaration. Beijing is now openly speaking against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Beijing is simultaneously paying Washington for more oil while publicly opposing the mechanism Iran is using to exploit the world and act as a mafia boss, holding the global economy hostage. That is not neutrality. That is a slow-motion defection, with China potentially removing itself from the equation, perhaps exiting stage left when it comes to Iran. Could China fully replace Iranian oil from other sources if it chose to completely cut off its dependence on Iran? The answer is a staggering and resounding yes, but it would not happen overnight. Over a 6 to 12-month timeline, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, and Russia could absorb most of those barrels, along with the United States. China's strategic reserves stood at nearly 1.4 billion barrels as of late 2025, roughly 4 months of total import coverage. So China possesses the buffer. What it had lacked until now was the political will. On the ground in Iran and within the Strait of Hormuz, the operational picture remains extremely tense. Both the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports and Iran's effective closure of the strait to non-friendly shipping remain fully in place. Tensions around this area are currently on steroids, resembling a figure with a massive upper body and no lower body, like an upside-down triangle. U.S. and Iranian forces exchanged fire in the strait as recently as May 7th, with reports of further exchanges following that incident. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who leads Iran's negotiation team, publicly declared that Iran is prepared for every option and will deliver a lesson-giving response to any aggression. Multiple Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps generals appear to be consolidating power in Iran with this martyr commander exercise. This is precisely the type of exercise name designed by a military commander with zero creativity, where those around him simply agree. In a fighter jet, one does not wait until the radar warning light illuminates to identify threats attempting to shoot it down. Preparation occurs before the threat even appears. The same principle applies to personal savings. Iran mining the Strait of Hormuz, market swinging on a single export, record national debt with no end in sight, and the S&P 500 still performing strongly, simply does not pass the sniffer test. A good fighter pilot gets educated before a mission. This is where Lear Capital comes in. Physical gold and silver are assets that cannot be printed, cannot go bankrupt, and have consistently outperformed the stock market for decades. They are tangible assets, offering complete control. A portion of an IRA or 401k can be moved directly into physical metals. Lear is an education-first company that provides information without pressure or a sales pitch, offering a 24-hour risk-free purchase guarantee. Lear was also named the best overall gold IRA company by Consumer Affairs. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 4 decades building a doctrine specifically designed to exploit the Strait of Hormuz's geography. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Minimum navigable channels for deep draft tankers are about 2 nautical miles on each side. The IRGC has transformed the surrounding islands, coastal batteries, and shallow waters into a layered weapons proxy network. They no longer maintain a regular navy, relying instead on this proxy network with fast attack craft armed with anti-ship missiles, mines in the shipping lanes, and shore-based NOR missiles, which have a Chinese origin. China's role in this context may now be diminishing. They also possess Shahed drones, capable of creating swarms to target Gulf partners and cargo ships. Iran's doctrine is not to win a conventional naval engagement. Its goal is to raise the cost of transit high enough that commercial shipping refuses to enter. They do not need to sink a carrier or a destroyer. They simply need to increase insurance rates, forcing cargo companies to be unable to secure insurance, thereby blocking all shipping. Ship captains are understandably hesitant to transit the Strait of Hormuz to deliver oil for $10,000, having witnessed other cargo ships explode due to proxy warfare tactics. This has created gridlock in the Strait of Hormuz, which is now being countered by the U.S., with a blockade squeezing $500 million a day out of Iran's IRGC. France sending its fast attack helicopters is also a significant and helpful contribution, despite its late arrival, bringing a baguette equipped with 20mm guns. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has also unilaterally redefined the strait itself. IRGC Navy Political Deputy Mohammad Akbarian announced a 10-fold geographic expansion zone that they consider under Iranian sovereignty, from roughly 20 to 30 miles around the key islands to now over 200 to 300 miles, stretching from the city of Jask in the east to Siri Island in the west. This is not a legal argument, but a physical claim that extends Iranian reach deep into the Arabian Sea, with no basis beyond a territorial assertion. International law states that 13.88 miles from a border is exclusive property, with an identification zone extending to somewhere around 24 miles. However, no real estate outside of 13.88 miles is owned, especially if it overlaps with other nations like Oman. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' hardline posture is currently being driven by IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and his inner circle, the same group blocking the Iranian president's cabinet. Akbarian is being blocked from taking any significant action. Vahidi is consolidating power on an unprecedented level. This level of power consolidation within the IRGC, particularly by a single commander, is highly unusual for Iran's historically factionalized political landscape, suggesting a deliberate shift towards a more centralized, militarized decision-making structure that bypasses traditional civilian oversight. The concentration of command means the decision chain is short, brittle, and militarily focused on the IRGC. Removing political will at the top or cutting oxygen from below would collapse the entire strategy faster than conventional military assessments suggest, perhaps not even requiring hard power. Given that internal fractures show a consolidation of power fully focused on the IRGC, this is where China's 3 levers come into play, potentially shifting the conflict and helping the United States open the international waterway. Lever 1. Beijing quietly or formally reduces Iranian oil purchases, which appears imminent. Iran sells at deep discounts because it has nowhere else to go. Cutting that buyer would drain the IRGC's war chest faster than any airstrike could achieve. Lever 2. Beijing's diplomatic cover ends unless Iran returns to the table for serious nuclear talks and an actual strategy to open the Strait of Hormuz. Lever 3. The seismic option, though less likely. The People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, escorts cargo ships and oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz itself. Chinese tankers already transit periodically. A PLAN frigate shepherding a Chinese-flagged convoy would rewrite the rules entirely, signaling Beijing's refusal to accept either Iranian tolls or a U.S.-only security framework, thereby shifting the balance of power in the Strait of Hormuz. With an understanding of China's leverage, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' defenses, and its power consolidation strategy, it is important to examine global developments. The global military picture is currently very busy. Russia's largest drone attack of the war occurred on May 13th and into the early hours of May 14th. Russia launched over 1,560 strike drones in waves, confirmed by Ukrainian President Zelensky, marking the single largest aerial assault of the entire war. A Ukrainian drone monitoring service recorded 168 separate Shahed-type drone tracks at one moment alone. 14 regions were hit simultaneously, targeting railway infrastructure, port facilities, and residential areas. President Zelensky noted the timing. The assault kicked off the same day President Trump's plane touched down in Beijing. He called it deliberate, a message to NATO from President Putin at the exact moment the world's two largest powers were shaking hands. Militarily, the Russians are testing whether daytime saturation attacks can overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses optimized for nighttime intercept patterns. Russia is testing different points of weakness in Ukraine. In India, 1 year after the 4-day India-Pakistan air war known as Operation Sinor, India is preparing to test fire the AGY-6 ballistic missile, claimed to have a range of up to 10,000 kilometers, with multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, meaning one missile could carry multiple nuclear warheads to multiple targets if confirmed. This places India in an elite tier of nuclear powers, alongside the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. This massive nuclear capability from India is not receiving the Western media coverage it deserves. It remains to be seen if it will increase tensions between India and Pakistan. Moving to strategic analysis, what does Iran actually want from this posture? Not what it says it wants, but what is actually going to happen. Credible analysts, reading the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' internal moves, suggest it is not a peace deal. They do not truly want a peace deal. It is about the survival of the regime and the IRGC in a form that retains relevance. The IRGC, under Ahmad Vahidi, is consolidating control over the Iranian government because war creates the conditions for this. The IRGC is indispensable at this point, positioning them to say, because it is wartime now, we are ready to seize power. A negotiated peace, including nuclear moratoriums, sanctions relief, and U.S. withdrawal from its blockade posture, would reduce the IRGC's power at home. They want to remain in this wartime scenario to seize power, to stall while they rebuild and prepare for the next wave of conflict, whether proxy strikes or full-ramped conflict. They are afraid of what happens to their authority inside Iran if the war ends on American terms or anything beneficial to the world or America, especially if they cannot control the Strait of Hormuz like a mafia boss. However, the A-10 Warthog, F-35, F-15E fighter jets, and the AC-130 gunship, one of the most capable gunships on the planet, might be deployed against these fast attack craft, as the IRGC is not expected to back down. This is not a small thing. It is not mere diplomatic decoration. This changes the entire architecture of the conflict playing out in the Persian Gulf. The question the world has been asking for months is simple. What happens when Iran's economic oxygen supply gets cut? The answer just became a lot clearer because China is that oxygen supply. China buys around 90% of Iran's oil exports, amounting to roughly 1.7 million barrels a day. 9 out of every 10 barrels Iran sells on the global market go to one customer. This is not a trade relationship, it is a lifeline. And that lifeline just publicly agreed with Washington that Iran's behavior in the Strait of Hormuz is unacceptable. President Xi made clear China's opposition to the militarization of the strait and any effort to charge a toll for its use. He also expressed interest in purchasing more American oil to reduce China's dependence on the strait in the future. So Beijing is simultaneously signaling that it wants more American barrels and less Iranian leverage. That is a slow-motion defection from the role China has played as Iran's primary economic patron for the better part of a decade. In response, while President Trump was landing in Beijing, the IRGC's Greater Tehran Command launched a large-scale military exercise focusing on readiness to confront enemy forces in any terrain, with its stated objective being to enhance combat ability to counter any hostile move by what commanders called the American Zionist enemy. Beijing ordered more American oil. Iran launched a war drill. One of those is the response of a country that reads the room. The other is the response of a regime terrified of what happens when the room stops listening. The numbers are genuinely staggering and tell a story that no amount of military posturing can change. This is the energy math where China's leverage over Iran actually lives, and the numbers are striking. Before the war, China was purchasing between 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels of Iranian crude per day, accounting for 13 to 15% of Beijing's total oil imports. That demand absorbed 80 to 90% of Iran's total oil exports. Without that, Iran has almost nothing left. No alternative buyer at that scale exists anywhere on the planet. Saudi Arabia will not touch sanctioned Iranian crude. Europe will not touch it. India buys some, but nowhere near enough to replace what Beijing brings. Iran built its entire wartime economic survival model around one customer, and that customer just publicly told the world in a joint statement with Washington that the Strait of Hormuz must stay open. Beijing did not arrive at this moment unprepared. China added an average of 1.1 million barrels per day to its strategic oil inventories throughout 2025, reaching nearly 1.4 billion barrels as of December 2025. Prior to the Iran conflict escalating, preliminary government data indicate that China continued building those inventories into 2026. With nearly 1.4 billion barrels in reserve, China's total reserve stockpile covers between 110 and 180 days of net import demand, far exceeding the 90-day safety standard set by the International Energy Agency. This is a country that has been quietly wargaming this exact scenario for years. China did not stumble into this position. It built it deliberately, barrel by barrel, while the world was watching something else. The situation becomes more layered when examining developments on the ground in the weeks leading up to today's summit. According to Bloomberg's energy analysis, Beijing has quietly slashed its oil imports by roughly a quarter from pre-war levels. This reduction in Chinese demand has become a key force rebalancing the global oil market during the Iran conflict. China reduced its Iranian oil intake by approximately a quarter, which barely made headlines in most Western press. However, the consequences for Iran's war chest were immediate and mathematical. Iran sells its crude at deep discounts, specifically because it has no other serious buyer. When the one buyer with real volume starts pulling back, the price pressure on Iran compounds fast. On May 11th, just 3 days before the Beijing summit, the United States sanctioned a dozen entities and individuals over the sale of Iranian oil to China, stepping up economic pressure in the final days before President Trump met President Xi. The timing was not accidental. Washington wanted Beijing walking into that room already feeling the heat of closing financial walls. Then on May 2nd, China's Ministry of Commerce issued its first formal prohibition order under its 2021 blocking rules, barring Chinese entities from recognizing, enforcing, or complying with U.S. sanctions, targeting 5 major Chinese refineries accused of purchasing Iranian crude. Publicly, Beijing was pushing back on American secondary sanctions. Then 11 days later, President Xi sits across from President Trump and agrees that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon and the strait must stay open. This is not a contradiction, but sophisticated geopolitical positioning. Beijing was protecting its domestic legal flank while simultaneously tilting its strategic weight toward Washington on the questions that actually matter in the long run. China has demonstrated that it possesses 3 separate levers that can squeeze Iran harder than any air campaign short of a full ground war, none of which require a single Chinese soldier to leave their barracks. Understanding the full operational picture of how those levers work and what Iran is actually doing in response reveals a strategic picture completely different from what the headlines suggest. Examining Iran's actions as Beijing shifts its weight, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' behavior over the last 72 hours indicates its trajectory, none of which suggests a regime reading the room correctly. On May 12th, just 2 days before the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing, IRGC Navy Deputy Political Director Mohammad Akbarian confirmed through Iranian state media that the IRGC's operational zone in the Strait of Hormuz had expanded dramatically, stretching 200 to 300 nautical miles from Jask in the east to Siri Island in the west, forming what Iranian officials are calling a complete crescent. Under its new definition, The IRGC is claiming a tenfold expansion of the waterway's operational width from roughly 20 to 30 miles to over 200 to 300 miles. This is not a legal argument. International maritime law gives Iran 12 nautical miles of territorial waters from its coastline, with everything beyond that being international water. The IRGC is doing something else entirely. It further stated that safe passage through the strait would only be permitted along a corridor specifically designated by Iran, warning of a decisive response against any vessels that deviate from those mandated paths. Iran is essentially telling the entire global shipping industry that it may transit one of the world's most critical waterways, but only on Iran's terms, through its corridor, under its watch. That is not a military posture. It is a mafia toll booth stretched across 500 kilometers of open ocean. This move is analytically revealing. The IRGC announced this expanded operational crescent on May 12th for use of the strait publicly on the record. In a joint White House readout, the IRGC drew its 500-kilometer crescent on Tuesday. Beijing erased the legal and diplomatic legitimacy of that crescent on Thursday. That sequencing is not a coincidence. It is Beijing sending Iran a message in the clearest language available to a superpower: public alignment with its adversary's position. The deeper and more dangerous story is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is behaving with such escalatory confidence, not because it believes it can win a confrontation against the combined weight of U.S. naval power and Chinese economic pressure, but because the IRGC, under Commander Ahmad Vahidi, has spent the last several months consolidating political control inside Iran itself. A dramatic consolidation of power within Iran has seen the IRGC effectively take command of both the country's military apparatus and its diplomatic direction. With Ahmad Vahidi, backed by a close-knit inner circle, emerging as the central authority figure in Iran, the civilian government of President Pezeshkian has been progressively sidelined. Iran International reported growing tensions between Pezeshkian and senior IRGC commanders, particularly Vahidi, over how the war should be managed, with Pezeshkian warning in late March that without a ceasefire the economy could collapse within 3 weeks to a month. The IRGC's response to that warning was not to seek a deal, but to launch more military drills. This reveals the single most important strategic truth about Iran in May 2026. The IRGC does not want this war to end on terms that reduce its own power. A negotiated settlement that includes nuclear moratoriums, the reopening of the Strait, and U.S. withdrawal from its blockade posture would strip the IRGC of the wartime emergency conditions that justify its grip on Iranian politics. Despite experiencing heavy losses, the IRGC kept operating through nearly 2 months of war against two major military powers without collapsing. Its decentralized structure allowed it to block the Strait of Hormuz and disrupt global energy markets. That institutional survival, that demonstration of resilience in the face of overwhelming firepower, is the IRGC's political capital inside Iran right now. It is not giving that up for a peace deal that Washington approves of, which means the pressure has to come from somewhere else. The only somewhere else with the economic mass to actually force Iran's hand just publicly declared which side of the line it is standing on. Now, the full architecture of what changed today is understood. The energy math, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' internal consolidation of power and its structural resistance to a peace deal on anyone else's terms, and why Beijing's public alignment with Washington on May 14, 2026 is not a diplomatic footnote but a tectonic shift. The final question for serious analysts is, what does China actually do next? Agreeing in a summit communique is one thing, following through is another. The answer comes down to 3 specific levers Beijing now holds over Iran and whether it has the political will to pull them. Lever 1 is the most immediate and economically devastating. Beijing quietly or formally reduces Iranian oil purchases to near zero. This is not hypothetical. China has already quietly slashed its oil imports by roughly a quarter from pre-war levels. That reduction alone has been a primary force rebalancing the global oil market during the Iran conflict. Iran has no alternative buyer of comparable scale. Saudi Arabia will not replace China as a customer for sanctioned crude. The discount Iran offers exists precisely because it has nowhere else to go. Removing the buyer means no additional airstrike is needed to drain the IRGC's war chest. Oil funds approximately 45% of Iran's government budget, and the International Monetary Fund estimates the fiscal break-even at between $121 and $124 per barrel. Chinese buyers are paying around $60 after the discount is applied. Iran was running deficits before the blockade even began. The math is not complicated. The IRGC cannot fund an indefinite military posture on a budget that was already bleeding before this crisis escalated. Lever 2 is diplomatic cover, which matters most for the negotiating table. For months, Iran has leaned on the assumption that Beijing's silence was tacit approval, believing China would never formally side with Washington on the nuclear question or on Hormuz's access, because doing so would expose the deepest fault line in its relationship with Iran. That assumption is now gone. President Xi reserved his sharpest language at the summit for Taiwan, calling it the most important issue in U.S.-China relations. But on Iran, both countries agreed in the joint White House readout that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon and that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open for the free flow of energy. The moment China co-signs those two red lines on the record, it withdraws the diplomatic insulation Iran has been hiding behind. Iran cannot tell the world that the international community is divided on these questions when the country that buys 90% of its oil just publicly agreed with its adversary on both of them. The core issue has not moved a single centimeter since the ceasefire was announced on April 8th. The U.S. position has been that Iran must conduct zero enrichment. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has said Iran will not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment. Iran has countered a proposed 12-year moratorium with 5 years, while the U.S. demanded 20. Zero enrichment versus the right to enrich? 20 years versus 5 years? These are not positions one compromise away from resolution. These are fundamental disagreements about what Iran is allowed to be as a state. Both sides have domestic political audiences that make meaningful concessions extraordinarily difficult. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization told lawmakers that the issues of nuclear technology and uranium enrichment are not on the agenda of any possible negotiations with the United States, with the committee spokesperson stating after the meeting that enrichment is not negotiable and necessary preparations have been made to protect nuclear sites and assets. This public declaration to Iran's parliament, rather than a back-channel negotiation, is highly unusual, signaling a deep-seated domestic political imperative to resist concessions on nuclear enrichment, making any diplomatic breakthrough extraordinarily challenging given the leadership's fear of appearing weak to hardline factions. That statement was made to the Iranian parliament, not floated through a back channel as a negotiating posture. It was a public declaration made to a domestic legislative audience, which means walking it back carries enormous political cost for Iranian leadership, already under pressure from hardliners who view any concession to Washington as an existential humiliation. While those negotiations drag on inconclusively, military and economic pressure continues to build from multiple directions simultaneously. Iran is not just facing diplomatic deadlock. It is facing a transformed regional environment in which the United Arab Emirates has demonstrated it will strike Iranian territory. Saudi Arabia has demonstrated it will strike Iranian territory. The White House has made clear it welcomes both. For Iran, the message was clear. The war was no longer limited to direct U.S., Israeli, and Iranian action. If reports are accurate, one of Iran's most important Gulf neighbors had quietly joined the fight. This refers to the United Arab Emirates, with which Iran shares maritime boundaries, with which Iranian merchants have done business for generations, and with which Iran maintained a complicated but functional relationship even through years of sanctions. That neighbor flew strike missions into Iranian territory and disabled a crown jewel of Iranian energy infrastructure. The psychological impact of that revelation on Iranian strategic thinking should not be underestimated. Iran's deterrence doctrine, its entire system of threats, proxy networks, and asymmetric pressure was built on the assumption that Gulf states would never cross the threshold into direct military action against Iranian soil because the risk of Iranian retaliation was too severe. That assumption is now empirically false. The United Arab Emirates absorbed nearly 3,000 incoming projectiles, watched fires burn across its cities, suffered casualties among its civilian population, and still found the institutional resolve and military capability to strike back directly.